Welcome. I am Mick, and we are all from the WreckRoomCedh Discord server, and we've all been getting some losses that we weren't super thrilled with, and we kind of want to talk about threat assessment in relation, provoked by our experiences in our kind of closed meta, but as it applies to CDH as a whole. I am a Tivit main in CDH. I've played since it was spoiled, and I'm on a slow Staxy variant, and I have been for the life of the deck. I have a background in brewing for Modern, and then I played a lot of Pauper in the Golden Age, but now I'm pretty much just on CDH from kind of COVID forward.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm Deke, and I was a legacy topless miracles player for a while. To kind of have that card control, one Monastery Mentor and a couple Jace as a win con, 4 accumulated knowledge kind of stuff. And that's what I like to do in CDH. I play Riel. That's my deck. It's a kind of a tempo control deck. So constantly threat assessing and talking to the table is what's necessary for playing that deck. So that's the slant I'm coming from. I also play some Tymna Crom. Deck is busted. I play it as a control deck, a little bit slower, and like decks that if the game goes long and I survive, I have that inevitability. So that's me.
All right, and I'm Sean or Kevin. I play mostly CDH now, absolutely, actually all CDH now, but I used to play Modern. I'd play Standard and Pioneer for F&M. I just liked going. I would go every week, so I wanted something to play every week. And then COVID happened and kind of switched over to Commander, and that led me straight into CDH so fast because of the competitive Modern and Standard games I was used to. I try to play what's best, so I'll play a little bit of everything, but mostly the mainstay was Kenrith, I'd have to say, and anything playing Adnons, really.
Yeah, for sure. So I think our perspectives here, we're going to have a little bit of everything. I am on the Staxiest variant of Tivit, at least among the ones that I've seen, and then we have control player, and then Kev traditionally is somewhere probably between turbo and mid-range for most of the decks that he's been playing. So those are kind of where our different thought processes are being formed as we talk about these things. The overarching thing here is going to be about threat assessment, and not just in snapshots throughout the game, but it's a process that you're going through at all times, and that starts before the game starts, based on the opposing commanders that you're seeing, even before you draw your opener. And one of the points that we thought was important to bring up is being able to talk to people about if there are decks at the table where you know what they're trying to do and you're not very good or not capable at all of stopping that. So what are some of the most pre-game conversation worthy decks in your opinion, Deke?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost is Cody, right? And we don't see a ton of Cody anymore, but Cody's the poster child for this. Cody is the deck that is the most consistent. Turn 2, put ad nauseum on the stack. That's the one thing that deck does. And so, when people got a handle on that, pre-game conversations kind of took that deck out of the meta. And it's really those pre-game conversations that have kept Winota down as well. Winota was a deck that people ignored for the first couple turns and realized real quickly that first kind of couple Winota flips, and they've lost their interaction point. So when there's a Winota in the pod, oftentimes it's beneficial to have that pre-game conversation saying all right, who's mulling to removal? Are we going to do this? Or are we just going to let the Winota go? What are your thoughts? Is kind of the way those pre-game conversations can go. And it behooves you to do that, right? If there's a deck at the table where your strategy does not line up against super well, really looking at the other decks at the table, like, okay, I'm a control deck. There's another Thras Bruce at the table. All right, we're gonna kind of work together to stop this Rog Sai and this Winota early on, and then we're kind of gonna battle it out between each other. But it benefits both of you for the game to not end on turn 2. And so really looking at before the game, what do we do before the game? What's the first thing you do, Kev, when you sit down to a table?
Definitely pay attention to who it is I'm playing with, if I've played with them before, and like their style of play. But then it's a commander check instantly. It's just the first thing you get to see. It's the first giveaway of what to expect. And from there, it's like you got a puzzle piece, like what are the possibilities? What are their early game possibilities? Are they trying to end it early? Are they trying to end it late? What am I looking for in my starting hand to deal with this? What seat position am I even in yet? Oh, I haven't even got there yet. Like, there's so many things to look at, really. There's too many branches. And it just...
Yeah, for sure. And I think the goal of this podcast right here is not to tell you how to threat assess for a specific deck. It's to give you kind of the process in which to do that and the questions to be asking yourself, right? We're not going to be able to tell you in this podcast like how to best threat assess for your deck. What we're going to tell you is kind of the pattern, the process that we go through, and why we do that to help you try to get those extra percentage points. So when you sit down at the table, the first thing is like, what's my plan? What is my deck trying to do, right? You may know that inherently, but I think a lot of times people sit down at the table, they look at an opening hand, you're like, this has some lands and spells, it's got a turn 1 Rhystic Study, that's good. But like really looking at the pod and being like, okay, what is my plan in this pod? Like, what is my deck trying to do in this pod? What am I trying to do in this turn order? Like, what am I trying to do in relation to the strategies that are at the table? And really looking around and being like, okay, what are each one of these decks trying to do on turn 1? I think the most poignant example is like, if you're looking at around the table and it's a Malcolm Timna, a 4-color Thrasios deck, a Rog Sai, and yourself. Cool. They're trying to turn 1 a Malcolm. That's 100% what's trying to happen there. Thrasios player might be trying to turn 1 a Collector Oof, or turn 2 an Oof. It could be starting with a Carpet, so that that's your lands. And then the Rog Sai player is either trying to put a value engine into play, or develop their mana so they can kind of burst out on turn 2. So that's the kind of things that we're saying here.
Yeah, for sure. And also, like, really be consciously and thoughtfully aware of like what your archetype really is, and maybe get enough reps in to define that down into an actionable sense. Like, for me, like Tivit, my build is, I would say, 60% a stacks deck and 40% a control deck or mid-range deck in that way. So like, I need to, when I look at a table, if they're known decks, we're like, okay, I know what your lines are going to be to try to win or just to try to develop through the game. I want to be aware of what stacks pieces I'm trying to get and kind of the priority on those. If there's a bunch of graveyard decks, then getting a turn 1 rest in peace is awesome most of the time. But if there are a bunch of mid-range decks that have different win cons, maybe 1 relies on the graveyard and 2 don't, or something to that effect, then it might be more advantageous for me to try to get the draw engine first and use that to get tutors for the individual pieces that are going to let me live long enough to eventually present a win with Tivit. So understanding specifically what you're trying to do, and then like what your good options are into that pod helps inform what you are even trying to look for in your mulligans. Not just what you actually keep, but like how you value a given hand once you start drawing those first cards.
help me out here. Where are we going next?
Yeah, no. So I think part of this is you open up a hand and you're like, oh shit, it's got a dockside in it. That's amazing. Evaluate that in the context of your pod. If you got 3 green decks that are playing dorks, like, that one land pedal and dockside may not be good enough, right? If your opponents go dork, 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 pass, you're in a rough spot. You don't have mana, and so, but if you sit down and there's 3 Sands green decks at the table, like that one land pedal turn 1 dockside that's going to make you 4 or 5 mana, likely is a busted hand. So really just paying attention to, like, what are these decks going to do. A lot of players decide on their mulligans before they even see turn order, before they see what the other decks at the table are. Like, take a moment. You're going to play an hour, 2-hour game sometimes. Like, take that extra 15 seconds to just pay attention.
Yeah. Sometimes you see a no-lander and you just know that you can't play it. But there are times where it's like there are pods where I don't even have to pay attention to anything pregame because my deck is trying to do one thing and I am mulling to that one thing, and if I get anything the deck might be really light on interactions, so if I'm not even trying to interact with them or protect myself, I'm just trying to do my thing, whether it be set up an engine type deck or just a glass cannon blasting, trying to do the one thing. Say it's a combo with your commander or something, like some Tivit builds.
Okay. Yeah. I think the one thing to say there is, like, if you are the blasting deck, right? If you're playing Mardu or you're playing Rogsai or something like that, like, some hands do the thing and aren't enough. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, like, if you're in seat 3 and there's 2 blue decks in front of you, there's some hands in those decks that, like, a fish or a Ristic from one of those 2 players, you just can't beat because you have to feed it 4 times before you play anything that does anything. And so, some of those times, you're really evaluating those hands on, like, okay, do I have a Flusterstorm to go through these decks? Do I have a Silence? And when is, like, the table Obnix, Tayam, and Sisay that's probably not going to interact with me, and I don't have to have any protection, I can just go.
Sometimes that's definitely just how it is, and you just are so giddy on those games, so giddy at the beginning. Like a Godot deck that just is also against, like, nothing, no sort of interaction. It's just like, okay, I win this race every time. Like,
yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, that's a good point too, and it also kind of leads into, even if you have a hand that does the thing, Remora's like one that I think most people are aware of, in their evaluation of what they're likely to go up against. But there's other things that are seeing more play, especially in particular decks, and this kind of ties into meta knowledge being really important. If you have a hand that does the thing, but you're against 3 decks that could be playing Grafdigger's Cage, and that messes up what you're trying to do, things like that are things that you need to be aware of. Winota was a really good example. We have a player who used to play a lot of Winota on our server, and I think against me, his average Winota flips per game was probably like 1. Like, I'm on both Cage and Priest, and Winota's also a must-kill commander, kind of like you touched on. So it's important to know what to expect, especially as the stock lists or just the list your friends are playing are changing. Those are things that you need to be aware of in your evaluations. New cards come out and new cards get played, and these things matter. Bowmaster is a great example, especially is for the case in Riel. Like that, I have played with you in some games where that's been extremely relevant. So.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that leads into our into our next little segment here of before the game even starts, and it's what deck is likely to be your natural predator, right? Which of these decks at the table just has your number? There's some decks that line up super well against other decks. This is coming from a 60 card format, I think. Playing Legacy, you're immediately like, okay, what land did they play first? Cool. Now I know what I'm playing against, and I know how good the cards in my hand are in comparison to them.
And that's
like,
also
what do I have to prioritize?
like when the meta is very small and condensed, like like it's just an option of one of 10 decks, like what it could be or what is possibility. I felt like that with the Legacy and Modern, and especially Standard play, it's even smaller. So like coming to CDH, that pre-game threat assessment of like what they could even be, I'm so glad that they show us the commander at the start of the game, so you at least know what's at the helm, and that has like a huge help. Like still, I think like the meta for CDH is so much wider than people like give it credit, and it is like you've got to have a lot of pieces memorized to come into a game and know what to expect.
Yep, absolutely. And then there's those signpost cards, I think early on that in turn 1 or 2, you can often tell what variant of a deck someone is on by one of the pieces. You'll notice. Boy, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Root
well, I
maze.
think
It's gonna be
there you go.
stack.
Sure. Root maze. I think if a deck plays Cage and it has red in it, you're like, okay, they're likely not on breach lines. There's these things you can cross out. But the biggest thing is like, is there a deck that if they get going, I cannot beat? Let's just talk about like WreckRoomCedh here for a second. I think that's a good example. So when you sit down against that deck, it's a prison deck. It's just trying to vomit out as many prison pieces as it possibly can. And you look at your hand, you look at the pod, and oftentimes the right answer for that deck, if you are a deck that is trying to go long, the thing that you cannot beat is that deck drawing 3 extra cards a turn with Tevesh. And so if my plan is to go long against a prison deck, I need to know the choke point. The choke point of that deck is the Tevesh, right? Only drawing 1 hate piece a turn, the table can likely beat that. Drawing 4 cards a turn with like 2 hate pieces in there, that's pretty hard to stop, right? Especially when it's also pooping out blockers and all of that. So looking around the table and knowing these choke points of decks, right? There's two types of pressure in CDH, and 3, but cards and mana, right, are the big ones. And
Okay.
so
Quick question, like since we're on that point, we just talked about one deck, but what about with a turbo Nas deck? Let's go with the. All right, we'll do the Tivit, but the turbo build. Like, where do you think like the choking point for that is? Like, it's built to either do the main combo that Tivits do, or it's built to go as fast as possible to draw as many cards as possible.
I'll give my answer before Mick gives his
ahead.
answer.
Yeah.
He's going to be the definitive expert here. But playing against the deck, that's a really good question, Kev. So I'm prioritizing blasts, right? Like a pyroblast or a red blast. If I can find one of those, I staple that in my mind to a Tivit, and I do not cast it unless I am literally going to lose the game. If I'm going to lose the game, I'll spend it. But if this is Turbo Tivit, they're just trying to land a Tivit or into Time Civ, whatnot. Pretty much any Tivit in general, honestly. I'm stapling a blast to that in my hand. Organizing my cards as such that I put it off to the side, and I don't even consider it in other lines.
Okay.
Or choke them on mana, depending on the deck you're in, right? like finding that null rod or collector oof to really shut off that deck, because it can't make mana otherwise.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, I have never been on the Nas variant because I'm contrarian by nature, which also makes me really grumpy that everybody's now playing stacks in Tivit when I have been the whole time, you nerds. But no, for a real answer though, I think the cards that hurt the most to see early if you're on a turbo Tivit build are obviously rod effects. There's some weirdo out there still playing Stony Silence probably. But also, if you can get a culling ritual off early against Tivit, and they only have like 3 lands, going into their turn, that's a totally neutered turn compared to trying to either Nas or to Tivit. You're probably going to be able to do one thing on your turn, and you might not be able to protect it if you do that thing. If you've just been culling ritualed with the expectation that you weren't going to be culling ritualed. Yeah, I think, well, like the Rod effects aren't played as much. Oof sees more play than Rod does. But green, I feel like, is pretty low in the meta overall right now. So I think more of the green decks are likely to play Culling Ritual than they are to be powering out Oofs right now. So yeah, those are the cards. Those are the ways that I would effectively do the things that we described, choking on mana. Those are the practical ways to do that prevent Tivit from doing the thing.
All right. Any other decks we want to try to do this with? Like, say, what's the choking point for a Krark Sakashima list?
That's an excellent question. The choke point for that deck is specific. It is to remove the Krark with the Sakashima on the way down. If you can do that, you've bought yourself like 3 to 4 turns, and that's a very long time. They will likely have spent a significant amount of resources to get there, Lotus Petals or Rituals or, Strike It Riches or whatnot, to try to, turbo those commanders out. When the Sakashima's on the way down, you get that Krark out of there, and you convince the table that this is the point, because there's no point after that. If you get past that point, the point then becomes when they cast a spell, you respond to the triggers. If you do not want to see that spell cast again in this same stack, you get it to the graveyard before those triggers resolve.
Okay. And last month's Boogeyman was a Najeela deck in the headband rounds. Like, what would you do to really make sure these Najeela decks don't run rampant?
Cross your fingers. I mean, almost every deck, I feel like I at least am able to get on the same, like in a 50-50 situation with them if I can get the correct stacks piece out. With Najeela, I remember playing a game where Josh was playing Najeela and I had Engines Online and we were going through our thing. I think I had Curse Totem and Rest in Peace out and like multiple stacks pieces. And I was like, okay, so like literally the only way he can win here is like just drawing Thoracle. He's like, all right, untap, upkeep, draw, cast Thoracle. I was like, fucking like 5-color soup, from the perspective of a stacks player, is hard to shut down effectively, but it's frustrating because there are pieces that, while good against it, don't completely stop it even for a turn necessarily, because there's so many angles. So it's hard to have both the relevant stacks and also interaction then for the Thoracle. It's very hard to have it all.
Absolutely. And that's one of those things where, and I think Najeela specifically falls into this place of like, people think they have time because she's got to get a couple of swings in before, she's swinging for 20.
It's really just if one piece comes out with those swings, the swings don't stop. So it's like you got to know exactly when to interact, and when to keep her just off the board, period. And you've got to pay attention to make sure their hand isn't developing a different combo while they're doing the whole thing. Like it's a very, very neat deck and very strong in that regard. Another
Absolutely.
one that I was going to ask about would be like we kind of touched base on Winota, but then there's Kinnan, which is similar but a little different.
I honestly haven't played against Kinnan in a while. I mean, so for what I'm trying to do, you know, if I'm not able to like kill or counter the Kinnan, then I feel like I've bought myself a turn or two if I have a cage on the field. Depending on the variant of Kinnan, like there's big flips and then there's like just strictly the combo. So it kind of depends, but I don't know. I mean, just kill Kinnan. Like
Sometimes that's all there is to it. Is but I just wanted to know if there were other talking points you wanted to have with that.
So I think that there are. Kinnan's an interesting one in that it's a commander-centric deck, but the commander is so cheap, and all the deck does is make mana. And so it's kind of like this intricate timing puzzle. And so what I'll say is like tempoing Kinnan is helpful. The two cards that I want to see from the decks I play specifically are Pyroclasm and Curse Totem. Curse Totem does a lot to stop that deck. It doesn't stop the Basalt combo. It doesn't. But it allows you to not remove the Kinnan, because a lot of the dorks and stuff are shut off. They still are making like 8 mana a turn via mana rocks, and so you do, the table probably does have to remove the Kinnan like at least once, even if there is a totem in play. But the best card against that deck is Pyroclasm or Dam or Winds of Abandon is a little too slow, unfortunately, unless you're gonna like dockside it out. Kinnan's quick, and it gets out of control quick. If they put an activation on this deck, that's a time when people don't respond, and they should more, because what can come off of that is so much. You can get a perplexing Chimera, and then you can't like interact at all. I don't know if you ever played against Kinnan on perplexing Chimera, but
I have the cards set aside, and I just haven't had a chance to just play Kinnan.
The deck does some things, and that's why it's like perennial one of the good decks. Wraths.
Yeah, being both the enabler and the outlet, turns out at 2 mana, that's pretty good for a commander. So one thing that this whole thing made me think of, though, is that I feel like in the meta right now, there's more must-kill commanders and just must-kill permanents than from my perspective, there have been in like the last year or so. And I think that's another thing before the game begins to be aware of. Like if you're on a deck that's not playing Cage or Containment Priest and you're going against a Winota and a Kinnan and another deck that has, let's say, a Hermit Druid line, in the first 2 turns of the game, you're likely to need the table to kill 3 things to like be able to get to turn 4, say. And that's an evaluation that you need to make in your hand for interaction. So it's a little frustrating that people are playing better cards, but it does need to inform how you play and how you mulligan.
Yep. Conversation I was having earlier is that people are kind of perennially putting Tivit, Tyam, all of these decks that are very commander centric, kind of at the top of their tier lists. And what we're not seeing is an increase in mana drains and delays. We're not really seeing those, and people are catching on to Fire Covenant. I think that's one of the best sweepers, if not the best, just creature sweeper. It's not Cyclonic Rift, but Fire Covenant is fantastic, and it deals with all of these problem commanders plus their development pieces. And really that's what you're looking for in control cards. Is like, we're at the point where there's so many must removes that if you're playing removal spells that aren't 1 mana or free, they need to take care of like all the problems at the table. And you know, if you can play, 2 of those in your deck, you're in a better spot, I think, in this meta. I mean, people are putting, Sisse, Tivit, Najila, like remove some cards, and do a bunch of them at a time. Should we move into turns, folks?
Starting turns or
Yeah.
or turn rotation. Seeing or.
Yeah, sure. I mean, are you guys more interested in talking about like early turns rather than mulligans at this point, or?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. We can go with mulligans and / turn order. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, so I think this is one that people talk about probably more than other early game things in general. So from my perspective, I can be relatively brief with what Tivit's looking for in the stacks build. I want either, at least 2 lands, 2 permanent mana sources of some kind, depending on what I have for card draw in the opener. And then I either want a resilient draw engine, so on the bottom end of that is probably something like Archivist of Ogma, and the top being Rhystic Study, and whatever in between. I play pretty much all of them in my build. And or looking for a stacks piece that hoses hopefully the fastest deck at the table. If not, at least 2 decks if they're more mid-rangey. So if there's 2 Thrasios decks, and then there's something slower like another stacks deck, a Rule of Law deck or something. If I have an opener with a totem and it's otherwise functional, I'm generally comfortable keeping something like that, depending on the pod. So yeah, value is something that disproportionately benefits me, especially as it relates to turn order. So if I can turn 1 Curse Totem into 2 green decks, I'm feeling good.
Yeah, I realize we haven't really been talking a ton about stack interaction. I think this is a decent time to do that. So, when looking at turn order and mulligans, there's a lot of hands that will have a bunch of interaction pieces, and I think we're all blue players normally, and so maybe we kind of just gloss over this for explanation purposes. But as Mick was talking about stacks pieces, interaction needs to line up as well. If you've got a pact in your opener, and you're not the fastest deck at the table, it's probably a dead card until at least turn 4, unless you get a fast hand, and then it's live, right? So really looking at like, what do I have? If you're playing something like Spell Pierce, you've got a Tayam and a Kinnan at the table. That card's fairly dead. There's a lot of cards that, while they're great, like, Flusterstorm, that's one of the cards that I'm happiest to see in my opening hand, playing the decks that I do. In some pods, it's close to dead, Yeah, sure, it can tag some cards. Every deck plays instants and sorceries, but, really the format has gotten to the point where card quality has gotten so high, and synergy has gotten so high, that really 1-for-1s have to really matter. And so looking at what those 1-for-1s are in your hand is really important to how they line up. I'm more likely to keep a slower hand if it has free or turn 1 interaction. And it also depends how your rocks line up. But whether I'm protected and have shields up on turn 1 or turn 2 as I kind of play out this goldfish is a big factor in keeping a hand.
One thing I like to think of as well is if I'm going to have to use my on-board interaction or my on-stack interaction with a certain deck as I'm viewing them at the table. Like they have, say I'm on my Tivit build, I don't have much for enchantments once they hit. I do touch white, but it's not enough to really go into it too much, so I'm more reliant on my bounce spells. But sometimes the bounce spell is just enough for 1 turn, but I need more than 1 turn, so it's not something I want to cast there. It's like, do I want to be countering their stuff, or do I want to be interacting with their stuff while it's on the board type thing? And if they're in my hand, like what assess from there, like what I could do or what I need to be doing or what I need to be looking for.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that on the build that I'm on, I have to think about a lot is it more beneficial for me to let something that's annoying for me but also annoying for everybody else to stick? Because there's situations where I end up with tons of value on board, but I'm still trying to get to my civ. And sometimes it'll take me several turns to get there, which Kev has been there for some of those games, where I'm clearly winning, but I just haven't drawn the tutors yet. But then in that interim, you have to evaluate if it's better for you to be able to have something static, to remove something static, or interact on the stack.
Alrighty, that'll bring us to a great little stopping point.